You alluded to this earlier when you talked about being literalistic, or the fact that Tim LaHaye says that you have to interpret the Bible literally. And by that, he doesn't mean interpreting the Bible as literature, but rather interpreting the Bible in a wooden literalistic fashion. So talk about the language of Scripture, particularly that of apocalyptic passages. If you read those passages in a literalistic, in this wooden literalistic fashion, you end up with sheer nonsense.
Yeah, it's amazing to me. I think Tim LaHaye wrote somewhere where the book of Revelation is the most literal book of the Bible. And again, if you mean by literal, it says dragons, so it has to be dragons. If it has a giant woman out in space somewhere standing on the moon and has 12 stars around her head and is clothed with the sun, well, then that's what you got. That is literal interpretation. But they don't interpret those passages that way. It's obvious that the book of Revelation, for example, has a lot of what you and I would say literal interpretations of various passages, but there's all kinds of symbolic passages, symbolic words all the way through the book of Revelation that even dispensationalists admit are symbolic. And so context is extremely important. And you mentioned that the word literal means according to the literature. And so you've got to understand what kind of literature that you're dealing with. That's number one. Number two, you got to look at the context of what, say, Jesus is saying in the book of Revelation or what Jesus is saying on the Mount of Olives. Then the number three is, then you've got to look at where is that particular passage found elsewhere in Scripture and how is it understood elsewhere in Scripture. And so you use the more clear passages in context to help you determine the less clear passages in context. That's what you have to do to interpret Scripture. You just can't look at a passage and just say, oh, it says that, therefore it's got to be that. Because there are too many places in Scripture where not even the dispensationalists, I remember Hal Lindsey even said, no one interprets all of prophecy literally. So we've got to get back to context and audience relevance and seeing how a passage is used elsewhere in Scripture to determine what it actually means.
Absolutely. A literalistic method of interpretation often does as much violence to the text as does a spiritualized interpretation that empties the text of all objective meaning.